It begins with a head, not a body, not a name. Just a head severed, blackened with tar, and mounted on a pike above the southern gatehouse of London Bridge. Travelers passed beneath it, merchants averted their eyes, and children pointed in hushed awe. No plaque, no epitaph, just a silent, rotting warning. This was the final image England wanted the world to remember of William Wallace. Not the warrior, not the voice of rebellion, just a skull grinning through decay, mute, mutilated, and defeated. And yet, somewhere in that grotesque display, something survived. A whisper beneath the spectacle. Because if Wallace was truly vanquished, if his story ended here, you wouldn't be hearing it now. His body was erased, yes, but his memory, that proved far more resilient than anyone expected. You've heard the name William Wallace before, maybe through a classroom, maybe through a movie, maybe through that single defiant word freedom echoed through Hollywood fog and battlefield mud. But what if I told you that version barely scratches the surface? What if the real story isn't about liberty but about fear? Not about a hero's last stand, but an empire's calculated effort to annihilate one man's existence piece by piece, nerve by nerve. Because Wallace wasn't just executed, he was destroyed. Systematically, psychologically, symbolically. And it wasn't out of rage or vengeance, it was out of necessity. The English crown didn't just want to punish rebellion, it wanted to engineer submission. In the summer of 1305, Wallace was captured not in battle, not with glory, but through betrayal. And what followed wasn't a trial, it was a message written in blood, carved in flesh, and stretched across the empire's borders. This isn't a martyr's tale, it's something colder, darker. This is what happens when a government decides that death alone isn't enough. This is the brutal, unfiltered story of the real execution of William Wallace and why it was far more horrifying than you've ever been told. To understand why they destroyed him the way they did, you need to understand who William Wallace really was, not the myth, not the movie version, but the man who made kings nervous and empires sweat. Wallace wasn't born to be a problem. He was a landowner's son, untitled, largely unknown, with no formal military training and no ties to Scotland's elite. In another life, he might have lived quietly, managing fields, paying taxes, keeping his head down. But history has a strange way of plucking ordinary men from the margins and dropping them into the furnace of revolution. By the late 1290s, Scotland was collapsing. Its king was dead, its nobles were fractured, and Edward I of England, known without a hint of subtlety as the hammer of the Scots, was tightening his grip not just through armies, but through a steady, suffocating erosion of identity. His vision wasn't conquest by fire, but submission by inevitability. And then Wallace happened. Out of nowhere, this outlaw with no pedigree led a rebellion so effective, so humiliating to England, it bordered on surreal. At the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, Wallace's ragtag force of commoners obliterated a professional English army. The battle didn't just shake Edward's military command, it shattered the illusion of invincibility. Wallace didn't fight like a nobleman. He didn't play by the chivalric code. He struck from the shadows, disrupted supply lines, vanished into forests. His warfare wasn't noble, it was effective, and that made him dangerous. Worse, his victories gave him something more powerful than territory, they gave him myth. He was knighted. He was named Guardian of Scotland. For a brief, flickering moment, this nobody from nowhere became the face of a people refusing to kneel. But empires don't fear swords. They fear symbols. Edward understood that Wallace the man could be killed. But Wallace the idea that required something more than steel. So when Wallace was eventually captured not in battle, but through quiet betrayal by a fellow Scot named John de Menteith, there was no rush to hang him. No swift execution, no soldier's death, because Wallace wasn't being punished. He was being unmade, not just erased from the world, but from the story. His identity, his dignity, his legacy, each would be stripped with cold, surgical intent. His death would not be an end. It would be a lesson. And that lesson was about to be written not in ink, but in blood. William Wallace's execution did not begin at the scaffold. It began on the road. After his capture in August 1305, Wallace was not granted the dignity of a quiet transfer or a swift judgment. Instead, he was paraded displayed from Scotland to London like a living trophy. This wasn't transportation, it was choreography. Every step was a message, every mile a public exhibition of submission. He wasn't thrown in a cart or kept hidden in shackles. No, Wallace was forced to ride bareback, chained and exposed through villages and cities where the people had been carefully conditioned to see him not as a man but as a monster. Along the way, English citizens were encouraged to mock him, to spit at him, to hurl insults and refuse. And they did, not out of personal hatred, but because the story had already been written for them. The Crown had spent years painting Wallace as a barbarian, a traitor, a heretic. What arrived wasn't a man, it was a caricature built by propaganda. The journey itself was designed not to kill him, but to wear him down, slowly, strategically. He was denied proper food, denied sleep. He rode in pain and filth, bound in such a way that every bump on the road would grind against bone and bruise. Some accounts suggest that by the time he reached London, he was already emaciated, coughing blood, drifting in and out of awareness. But that's exactly where they wanted him. Not dead, but fraying a man stretched so thin that when the time came, there would be no resistance left, only surrender. When Wallace finally arrived in London, the city did not react with outrage or discomfort. They celebrated. To them, this was not a human being returning from war. It was a beast being led to slaughter. The crowd swelled to see him. They cheered not out of bloodlust, but out of patriotic satisfaction. The enemy of the realm had been caught. The crown had won. Justice, they were told, was coming. But Wallace's trial was no trial. He was brought to Westminster Hall, a place steeped in royal authority, and placed before a court that had already decided his fate. He was accused of treason, murder, sacrilege, and war crimes. Notably, they did not charge him for merely fighting. They charged him for how he fought unconventional tactics, surprise raids, hitting supply lines. Not knightly, not honorable. But Wallace, still broken, still breathing, responded with one sentence that cut deeper than any blade. "I could not be a traitor, for I was never Edward's subject." And in that moment the courtroom stilled, because in that one line he did something few dared. He denied the legitimacy of the English king entirely. That wasn't rebellion. That was heresy against the political order. A man may break a law and be punished, but a man who rejects the law's very authority, he must be erased. The court didn't deliberate. They didn't pause. William Wallace wasn't sentenced to death. He was sentenced to disappearance, to a carefully constructed descent into nothingness. A dismantling not just of body, but of memory. And so the real performance began. They didn't choose that location by accident. Smithfield was where livestock was sold, where criminals were hanged, where the people came to watch justice with bread in their hands and blood in their eyes. This was not a place of solemnity, it was a theater. And William Wallace was the headline act. He arrived filthy, broken, dragged through mud and excrement, barely recognizable as the man who once defied an empire. He wasn't placed on the scaffold, he was thrown there. And the crowd surged forward, not with pity, but with hunger. They didn't want death, they wanted a performance. And that's exactly what they got. The first act was the hanging, but this was no ordinary hanging. There was no drop to snap the neck, no swift relief. Instead, Wallace was hoisted into the air, slowly, rope tightening around his throat, his body kicking and convulsing, the color draining from his face. But just as unconsciousness crept in, they cut him down, still alive, barely breathing, and now ready for what came next. The second act, emasculation. The executioner produced a small hooked blade, not for speed, not for mercy, but for precision. In full view of the crowd, Wallace's genitals were sliced off and burned before his eyes. It was not just physical destruction, it was symbolic annihilation. The message: this man will leave no legacy, no lineage, no future. His rebellion ends here not just with his death, but with the obliteration of his very ability to reproduce. But they weren't finished. The third act, disembowelment. With practiced hands, the executioner sliced open Wallace's abdomen. Feet upon feet of intestine were pulled from his body, inch by inch, slowly, agonizingly. The crowd watched as Wallace, still conscious, saw his own organs removed and tossed into the fire. There were no screams, Some say he was silent. Others say his eyes followed every movement wide and blinking, fully aware of what was being done to him. Imagine that not just feeling pain, but watching it, knowing that your death is being orchestrated not for punishment, but for display. The fourth act, extraction of the heart. His chest was opened. The heart symbol of courage, of life, of resistance was torn from his body and thrown onto the flames. That was the final act of torture, but not the final act of the message. Because William Wallace was still more than a corpse. He was a symbol, and symbols must be erased. So his body was beheaded, his head preserved in tar and mounted above London Bridge. And then his torso was quartered, arms and legs hacked off with rough axes and crude saws. Each piece of him, a limb, a warning, was sent to a different corner of the kingdom, not for burial, for display. Because this execution was never just about killing a man. It was about sculpting a memory in blood and bone, teaching a lesson without words, showing the world not what happens when you lose, but what happens when you refuse to kneel. This was not the death of a rebel. It was the ritual dismantling of defiance itself. When William Wallace's body fell silent, the blades did not. Death wasn't the end. It was only the intermission, because now came the part that mattered most to the English crown, not how he died, but how he was remembered. And to control memory, they had to control the body. His head, still slick with tar, was hoisted above the southern gatehouse of London Bridge. There it stood, leering over travelers and traders, staring down at the capital like a grotesque gargoyle. Not a warning carved in stone, but one made of skin bone and hair rotting slowly under the English sun. But that wasn't enough. The rest of Wallace's body was divided not randomly, but with deliberate surgical symbolism. One quarter was sent to Newcastle, a city on the border with Scotland where the shadow of rebellion always lingered, a daily reminder to those tempted by defiance. Another went to Berwick-upon-Tweed, a town long caught between Scottish loyalty and English occupation. There Wallace's limb would hang as a bloody exclamation mark, "This is what side you're on now." A third was nailed up in Stirling. Yes, Stirling, the very place where Wallace had once humiliated the English army, where the Scots had triumphed under his command. To hang a part of him, there wasn't punishment. It was reclamation, a rewriting of that battlefield with his own flesh, and the final piece. It was sent to Perth, another cradle of Scottish resistance, another page in the book of Wallace that the crown sought to burn with bone and blade. These weren't graves, these were billboards. The body of Wallace became a grotesque map, an anatomical propaganda campaign stretched across a kingdom. The message was clear: this empire doesn't just defeat you, it scatters you. It makes sure no one place, no one shrine, no one patch of earth can hold your memory intact. To those who walked beneath his limbs, soldiers, clergy, merchants, children, Wallace wasn't a martyr, he was an anatomy lesson. His bones taught obedience, his absence taught fear. But something strange happened, because even as his body rotted on gates and walls, something else began to grow. His name whispered in taverns, his story passed in secret between families, his defiance not erased but ignited. The English crown had succeeded in tearing Wallace apart, but in doing so they had also spread him, piece by piece, not just across land but across memory. And in every place where his flesh was nailed up, something far more dangerous than rebellion began to take root. Belief. Empires know how to kill. They've perfected it. But what they often forget, what they cannot fully control, is what survives after. Edward. I believed he was ending a rebellion when he executed William Wallace. In truth, he was creating something much more enduring, a martyr he could not silence. Because the performance at Smithfield with its knives and fire and rope was never about justice. It was about domination through fear. It was about teaching the people of Scotland and anyone watching that to rise up was not just to die, but to be unmade. To have your body turned into theater, your pain turned into policy, and your story swallowed by the state. But fear, once seen clearly, doesn't always work the way tyrants expect. What Edward I miscalculated, what so many powerful men have miscalculated, is that death is only final when it's forgotten. And Wallace, for all the horror he endured, was never forgotten. In the decades that followed, his name didn't fade. It was whispered in outlaw songs and murmured in dark corners of churches. His story, smuggled like contraband across border towns, grew larger, not in spite of the violence that ended him, but because of it. The spectacle had failed. By trying to erase his identity, the crown had accidentally cemented it. Wallace became the rebel who could not be contained, the man who walked to his death and did not kneel, not once, not even when the rope burned his throat, not when the blade took his body, not when the flames consumed his heart. And that's why this story endures. Not because of how Wallace died, but because of what he refused to let them take. They took his sword, his title, his body, but not his defiance. Not his idea. And in the end, that's the part of him they feared most. Because ideas do not bleed, they burn. And the more you try to silence them, the louder they scream. So remember this, Wallace was not just executed. He was transformed by the very machine meant to destroy him into something sharper than steel and more enduring than empire. He became a reminder that even when the body is shattered, the will can remain, and that sometimes the most terrifying thing an empire can face is a man who dies with his eyes open.